Hello, everyone. I'm Barbara Turgeon, and on behalf of the History Department at Ohio Wesleyan, welcome to all of you to the Richard W. Smith Lecture on the Civil War. First, I'd like to say that Dick Smith and Betty Smith are here, and so many of you know, but not necessarily everyone, that this lecture series was endowed more than 20 years ago by former students of Dick's because they carried with them their entire lives the love of having taken a class from him. Now, yes, indeed, he did produce 19 Ph.D.s, but it wasn't the Ph.D.s necessarily who were alone in doing this, not at all. I've heard some former students say, I got a B+, I was used to A's. So it wasn't that he was an easy grader or anything like that. He just was so passionate about the Civil War that he instilled passion in them, and it stuck with them. Now, this is also the gift that keeps on giving because our students benefit from this. Every year we're able to bring in a nationally renowned Civil War historian to speak in a setting like this, public, perfect town and gown kind of lecture. But they also come to my Civil War class. And I will tell you that every year these nationally known historians come to my class and I learn something. Oh, I shouldn't have said that. I learn something. So not only do my students learn something, but I do. And in reflecting on this, each year when I learn something like that, I stash it to make it into my lecture the next year. And so even though today there are students in this classroom taking this year's Civil War class, the knowledge that's been imparted carries on year after year after year. So it is truly a remarkable gift. So thank you to all of the former students and donors of this lecture series. Now, speaking of giving, I'm going to announce that there's a second way for people to contribute to the legacy of Dick Smith, and that is there is a Dick Smith Journal Fund. What does that mean? Well, as you all know, it's a digital world. And so our new library has had and will have access to electronic databases, digital libraries. And there's one in particular, it's called JSTOR, the letter J -STOR, that is essential for historians to do research. It's interdisciplinary, but it's essential for any historian doing research to be able to research the peer-reviewed top scholarly journals. But it's essential then for our undergrad history majors when they're taking History 250, our methods class, they need to be able to access this as well. And so what this fund will do is it will go directly to paying for these essential journals. So just something for you to consider on the way out there. I think there's a little card that tells you about that. Okay, to tonight's speaker, I want to say that I always like to ask them, given that this lecture series was endowed by students who had a professor who had a profound impact on them, how did the speaker come to history, loving history? How did the speaker come to loving Civil War history? And so, in asking our speaker tonight, Professor White, how did you come to loving history? Well, I kind of grew up with it because the family home was a 1720s farmhouse outside of Philadelphia. He went into his backyard and he dug up stuff from the 18th century and the 19th century. Now, instead of becoming an archaeologist, his grandfather told him stories about the Civil War because his grandfather had served as a Union soldier. Now, despite that strong influence of love of history, love of the Civil War, when he went to undergrad at Penn State, he thought he'd major in business. However, that quickly went away when he took an intro U.S. history class, and the professor of that class had a profound impact on him. He changed to a history major. And to this day, he and that professor share Christmas cards. So that's the kind of thing that we're talking about. All right, so he then went to the University of Maryland for graduate school and did a dissertation on anti-war Democrats. He was interested in what the opposition was like during Lincoln's administration. He got a really excellent job after he graduated, before he became a professor. That is, he became an historian for the federal judiciary, an historian doing research on the history of the federal courts. And that was in Washington, D.C. There is a federal judicial center. And so he did that for a year. And now, as you know, I think from the program, he is a professor of American Studies at Christopher Newport University. He is the author-editor of 19 books. Now, I try to think of a prolific just doesn't do it, right? Prolificer. Well, that's not a word. Really, really prolific? I couldn't come up with anything, but you get my point. One of those books, A House Built by Slaves, African-American Visitors to the Lincoln White House, won the Gilder Lehrman Lincoln Prize. And I will tell you that that is the most prestigious prize for a book written on the Civil War. There is just nothing beyond that award. Tonight's lecture is derived from his recent book, you gotta love this title, Shipwrecked, A True Civil War Story of Mutinies, Jailbreaks, Blockade Running, and the Slave Trade. Now, you know from the title of the lecture what we're going to learn is that Abraham Lincoln took on trying to end the transatlantic slave trade. It had been illegal for decades and decades and decades. But he takes this on during the Civil War when he was a little busy trying to save the Union, right? So anyway, we're going to learn how did he do that? How did he do that? But I want to finish by saying that perhaps his most important book is his most recent book, and that is My Day with Lincoln, a children's book. And I will say that it received rave reviews, especially from two pretty serious critics, his two daughters. And so please join me in welcoming Dr. Jonathan White to the station.
Well, it's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Barbara, for that very kind introduction and for inviting me to be here. I have to say it's been such a wonderful day. I got to go to her class this morning. I know some of the students are here. And then a wonderful lunch where I met Professor Smith at lunch. And, you know, one of the incredible things about this event is the number of people who've come up to me and said, I had his class in the 1960s, or I had his class in the 70s or the 80s. And just the number of alums who come back to an event like this to honor their professor is really incredible. I hope someday I have students who look at me in that way that they look at you. I mean, what a legacy that you have here. It's really something. I should add, too, that my parents are in their late 70s, early 80s, and they're downsizing their house. We moved out of that 1720s house when I was 14, but I took all of the bottles and belt buckles and other pieces of shards of metal that I found with me. And now that they're downsizing, they've made me take all that stuff to my house. And my wife is not thrilled about it. But it's all sitting in our garage, kind of out of the way. But it's what got me here in a very real way, was digging up the stuff of history and getting to touch it with my hands. So today I'm going to talk about the history of the slave trade during the Civil War. And to do that, I actually have to take us all the way back to 1787 to the Constitutional Convention. So the Constitution was written in 1787, and it contained 3 clauses that had to do with slavery. It never used words like slave or slavery or enslaved because James Madison said that they did not want to enshrine the idea of property in man in the Constitution. But there were 3 clauses that did have to do with slavery. Everyone who read the Constitution knew that this is what it was about. And one of them had to do with the importation of Africans. Now, the language of this clause is very convoluted and very difficult to understand. My students, when I teach it, get kind of confused what it's about. But the import of this clause was that you could not ban the importation of Africans for 20 years. But if Congress wanted to, it could ban the importation of Africans as slaves after a 20-year period. And this was a compromise measure. This was giving something to the Deep South. White Southerners in places like South Carolina and Georgia wanted to be able to import Africans in great numbers. People further north opposed the transatlantic slave trade, and so they came up with this compromise. You've got 20 years to carry out the slave trade as much as you want, and then if Congress wants to end it after that period, you can do so. And in 1807, Congress passed a law banning the transatlantic slave trade to go into effect on January 1st, 1808, and that law was signed by Thomas Jefferson. One of the things we have to realize is that even though many in America were pro-slavery or were slaveholders themselves, most white Americans, even if they were pro-slavery, recognized the evil of the Middle Passage. And so they were willing to pass this law banning it. But as we all know, just because something is illegal doesn't mean that people stop doing it. And so the slave trade continued. And 12 years later, in 1820, Congress passed another law that declared slave trading would now be piracy, meaning you could be executed for slave trading, just as a pirate would be executed. But again, just because you make something illegal, and even if you make it a capital offense for which you can be executed, people continue to do it. And slave traders continued to go out of American ports or using American ships on the high seas, importing Africans. Most of them did not come to the United States at that point. Most of them were going to Brazil, and then after 1850 into Cuba. But Americans were involved in that illicit slave trading. And this is an image that was produced by abolitionists in the late 18th century to give you a sense of what the hold looked like on a slave trading vessel, where these human cargo are packed in very, very tight. Well, the first story I want to tell, and this is a little bit of background, the first story I want to tell will take us to the west coast of Africa in August of 1860. There was a slave trader named Nathaniel Gordon. He was from Portland, Maine, and one of the interesting things about America's involvement in the slave trade is that much of that involvement involved New Englanders. So Nathaniel Gordon was from Portland, Maine. He had participated in at least 4 slave trading voyages in the 1850s. He was very experienced in this trade. And in August of 1860, he took his ship, the Erie, which you see pictured here, to the west coast of Africa, and he loaded the Erie with 897 Africans. Most of these were women and children. Some were as young as 6 months old. None appeared to be older than 40. He was going after the weakest of the weak. He purchased them with whiskey. That's what he used to buy these people. And he loaded them onto his vessel, and he was so experienced, by one account, he was able to do it in 45 minutes. He had a bladed weapon that he used to cut the remnants off of the remnants of clothing off of the men and women, and then he used that blade to separate them so that the men would go below decks on one side and the women would go below decks on the other side, and he loads them up very quickly. He then set sail, heading west back towards probably Cuba. And as he set sail, after a couple of hours on the Atlantic Ocean, he sees another ship coming towards him. Now, under international law at this point in the history of the world, the British had made treaties with most of the Atlantic world so that the British were able to search for vessels to see if they were slave traders. But the Americans had refused to make a deal with the British, because the Americans had the memory of the War of 1812, where British ships would board American vessels and force American sailors into the Royal Navy. And so the Americans refused to allow British ships to search them for evidence. The Americans refused to allow the British to search American ships for evidence of slave trading. And so when Nathaniel Gordon is on the high seas and he sees the ship approaching, he has to make a decision. Do I think this is a British ship or an American ship? If he thinks it's a British ship, he'll run up the American flag, because then they will not be allowed to search him. But if he thinks it's an American ship, he'll run up some other nation's flag, because the Americans would not be allowed to search him then. And so he takes a gamble, and he runs up the American flag, possibly the one you see in this painting there. And then the USS Mohican runs up its American flag. And it approaches him, it overtakes him. They go on board, and they see below decks the 897 human beings. These are not the enslaved people from the Erie. These were from another ship where the slaves were rescued. But if you look at this photograph, you can see the exact demographic groups that Gordon was kidnapping, women and children. You can see all of these young kids at the front of the ship. Well, the Africans were sent back to Africa, although they were sent to Liberia, which is actually a very tragic story. Many of them died along the way, and then in Liberia they were treated very badly. So it's not a happy ending for them, even though they're rescued. Gordon and his crew, meanwhile, are arrested, and Gordon is sent to New York City for trial. Now, New York was the commercial center of the world at that point, or one of the commercial centers of the world. And it was also the maritime center of the United States. Most of American shipping was going in and out of New York City. And so, for those reasons, New York was the place where if there was a trial that would take place because of a crime that had happened on the high seas, it would most often be in New York. And so Gordon is brought to New York, and he is put into what we would today consider a minimum security prison. And Gordon figured, I've got nothing to fear here. Because slave trading had been illegal since 1808, and it had been piracy since 1820, and no one had ever faced the fullest extent of punishment for this crime. Because what often happened was slave traders would bribe a jury, and they would get either a hung jury or get acquitted, or they would bribe a jailer, and they'd be allowed to escape, and some of them just left the United States. And so Gordon goes to prison, and they offer him a plea deal, but he's so convinced that nothing will happen to him that he rejects the plea deal. And for a $50 bribe, the jailer would let him out of the prison where he could walk around the city as a gentleman having fancy dinners. The president at this point was a Pennsylvania doughface named James Buchanan. A doughface means he was pliable. You could kind of mold him. He was a northerner, but he had southern principles. The southerners controlled him. And they knew, people like Gordon knew, that with James Buchanan as president, he had nothing to worry about. He goes to trial. Almost certainly some of the jurors were bribed, and he winds up with a hung jury. Now, Gordon thought he's going to just get let go. But by now, Abraham Lincoln is president. And in May of 1861, Lincoln called his cabinet together, and he told them that he wanted them to destroy the transatlantic slave trade. And Lincoln was not going to allow Gordon to get away with this. So, with a new U.S. Marshal now, they moved Gordon from the minimum security prison to what we would today call a maximum security prison, which was colloquially known as the Tombs. It was in Midtown Manhattan. No longer for a $50 bribe is Gordon allowed out of prison to have fancy dinners in Lower Manhattan. He goes to trial again. This time they sequestered the jury so that they could not be bribed, and this time they get a conviction. Now, depending on your view of capital punishment, you may look at this situation and say, this is a great step forward in the history of humanity. Finally, for the first time in the history of the United States, someone who participates in one of the most egregious crimes imaginable will finally be punished. But believe it or not, thousands and thousands of Northerners signed letters and petitions to Abraham Lincoln asking him for pardon. This is a petition from the National Archives, one of many that are there, signed by nearly 200 people from the state of Maine, from Portland, Maine. And you probably can't quite make out the words here, but the import of them is, Nathaniel Gordon has a really nice mom, and a really lovely wife, and a young child, and some delightful sisters, and a fond circle of friends. You wouldn't want to execute someone with all of these nice people around them, would you? Other people wrote to Lincoln and said, Gordon never saw it coming because no one's ever been punished for this crime, so it wouldn't be right to execute him because he didn't think it would actually happen. Other people wrote to Lincoln and said, we've shown now that we can catch slave traders. We don't need to execute him. Commute his sentence to life in prison and let it go at that. And so Lincoln is faced with a dilemma. Now, Lincoln was pretty well convinced that he was going to allow this execution to take place. But there was an incredible amount of pressure on him in this moment. The execution was set to take place in February of 1862. If you know the history of the Civil War at this point, this is when the Peninsula Campaign is just getting underway. And Lincoln is very frustrated that his commanding general, George B. McClellan, will not move against Richmond. At the same time, Lincoln is facing incredible personal struggles. His two little boys, Willie and Tad, drank some water out of the canal in Washington, D.C. and had gotten very, very ill. Tad would recover, but Willie, 11 years old, would be dead before the end of the month. And so Lincoln is dealing with this extraordinary personal issue. And at this moment, when Lincoln is trying to get his army to move and to save his little boys, Nathaniel Gordon's wife and mother show up at the White House with a petition signed by 11,000 New Yorkers calling for Lincoln to show mercy. And Lincoln, to paraphrase, just says, I can't talk to these women right now. They can talk to Mary. And so they talked with Lincoln's wife and pleaded with her, and Mary then went to Lincoln and pleaded on their behalf. And Lincoln did something that I think is characteristically Lincolnian. He wasn't going to grant a pardon, but he granted a 2-week stay of execution. He said essentially, if Nathaniel Gordon wasn't expecting to be executed, I'll give him 2 weeks to think about it. And the way that Lincoln wrote it in this, it's Lincoln's gallows humor. The way Lincoln wrote it, he said, so that Gordon may prepare for the awful change which awaits him. Now, this is a little piece of the stay of execution here. And I want to read it to you, but I've got to actually look at it on my screen because I can't make it out there, and it's very tiny. But let me see if I can make this out. This is what Lincoln wrote. Can I make this a little bit bigger? He said this, in granting this respite, it becomes my painful duty to admonish the prisoner that, relinquishing all expectation of pardon by human authority, he refer himself to the mercy of the common God and Father of all men. I love this line from Lincoln. You see, the Supreme Court in 1857 had said that Africans and their descendants in America were nothing but articles of merchandise to be bought and sold whenever a profit could be made. And from Nathaniel Gordon's perspective, that's all that black people were. And in granting this respite, not only was Lincoln giving Gordon 2 weeks to think about it, but he was reminding him that Africans and African Americans were human beings made in the image of God who deserved dignity and respect and were not to be bought and sold in this way. Well, Gordon had 2 weeks to think about it, and on the night before his execution, some friends snuck a cigar into the tombs with poison in it. Gordon did not want to go to the gallows. And so in the middle of the night, he cracked open the cigar and took out the poison and swallowed it. And the guards heard him writhing in pain, and they rushed into his cell at 2 or 3 in the morning, and they see him on the ground convulsing, but they will not let him cheat the gallows. So they summon a doctor, they bring him in, they pump his stomach, he vomits out the poison, and they keep him alive till noon the next morning. And he's so weak at that point that he can't walk on his own, but they basically carry him down to the gallows, where somewhere between 50 and 450 people, we don't know the exact number, went to see him executed. The only time in American history that a slave trader received the full punishment of the law was Nathaniel Gordon in February of 1862, right in Midtown Manhattan. Now, among Lincoln scholars, a lot of Lincoln folks know at least the outline of the Gordon story. It's fairly well known because of the importance of the case. Around 2014, I decided I was going to write a history of the slave trade during the Civil War. And in 2015, I had a research assistant, an undergraduate, who was working for me through a paid internship opportunity. And I gave him a list of names. And I said, okay, these are all slave traders that I know about. I want you to go onto newspapers.com and genealogybank.com and some of these databases that are really valuable for historical research. And I said, I just want you to search for these names and see what you can find. And one day in the summer of 2015, my student assistant, Daniel Glenn, comes into my office and he says, have you ever heard of Appleton Oaksmith? And I thought, that's the weirdest name I've ever heard of. No, like if I had heard of the name Appleton Oaksmith before, I wouldn't have forgotten it. And I said, why do you ask? And he said, well, his name keeps coming up in these articles. I said, well, keep searching, see what you can find. And I figured I'll do a chapter on Appleton Oak Smith in the course of my book. But the more I began to dig into his story, the more I decided that he deserved a biography of his own. And so what I'm going to do now is tell you the story of Appleton Oak Smith, this sailor that no one's ever really heard of before, and what it illuminates about Lincoln and the destruction of the slave trade, because it shows the great lengths that Lincoln would go to kill off the slave trade. Well, Appleton was also born in Portland, Maine, to a very prominent mother named Elizabeth Oak Smith. Elizabeth Oak Smith was an important first-wave feminist. She was a lecturer, a poet, a novelist, a playwright, an essayist, and a journalist. She was a household name in her day. And I'm actually convinced that if the story I'm about to tell you hadn't taken place, we would know who she is today in the same way that we know people like Susan B. Anthony or Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Now, she was also born near Portland, Maine in 1806, and as a young woman, she wanted to be a teacher, but instead, her mother wanted her married off. And at 16 years old, she was married off to a man in his mid-30s named Seba Smith. Seba Smith was a journalist in Maine, an up-and-coming guy. Now, I believe that their marriage was happy at first, but over time, Seba kind of dabbled in all sorts of things that were not financially profitable, and Elizabeth ended up having to be the main breadwinner of their family, and she grew to resent him very much. By the 1880s, a decade after he had died, she wrote in an unpublished memoir about her wedding day. And in that memoir, she wrote about what a dark day it was and how she had to marry this old man who was very bald. Now, I'm going to pause for a second and just say, I don't understand the issue. But I will also point out that they were married in the 1830s, and this picture was taken about 1860, and look at all that hair. Like, I would kill for a head of hair like that. At any rate, they ended up having several boys born into this literary family. Seba would become very famous for writing a series of fictional stories called the Jack Downing stories about a country bumpkin from upstate Maine who would travel down to Washington, D.C. and advise Andrew Jackson about how to be a good president. And everybody in the 1830s and 40s and 50s loved the Jack Downing stories. It didn't matter if you were a Democrat or a Whig. So as a young man in the 1830s, when Lincoln was still in his 20s, he read the Jack Downing stories and loved them. And so Seba and Elizabeth Oak Smith begin their family together, and they have a number of boys. And their favorite son was a boy named Appleton. Now, Appleton grew up in New York City. They had moved there in the 1830s, and he grew up in New York. And Elizabeth was part of the literary circles there. She traveled with people like Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and Edgar Allan Poe and Horace Greeley. All of the literary lights of the 19th century loved her work. But because she and her husband were somewhat estranged at that point, he would not go with her to literary soirees. Instead, she would take her sons. And in the 1840s, they would go to the home of a beautiful young woman named Anne Lynch. And Anne Lynch would have all of the most famous writers over, and Elizabeth was there, and there was her young son, Appleton. And I can't prove this, but I think that Appleton fell in love with Anne. And the reason I think it's her is that he wrote about the woman he fell in love with, and he only used the letter L to describe her. And I think it's got to be Anne Lynch. But for some reason, it fell apart, and when the relationship fell apart, he decided to leave New York. He just couldn't bear to be there anymore. And he got on a boat, and he headed around the coast of South America on his way to San Francisco for the gold rush. And when he gets to San Francisco, he thinks that this is where he's going to spend the rest of his life. But San Francisco was full of crime, and there was a lot of arson. And an extra-legal police force set itself up called the San Francisco Vigilance Committee, and they just went out and with their own authority started arresting people, trying them, throwing them in jail, and executing them. And Appleton began to feel a little uncomfortable with being part of this Vigilance Committee, and so he turned in his gun and his commission, and he acquired a boat, and after a few months in San Francisco, he left, and he went back around the coast of South America. This is 1851 into 1852. So he acquires this boat, the Mary Adeline. He's going around South America, and as he's going, he's stopping at port after port after port, trying to find a cargo that will take him back home to New York. When he finally gets to Rio, he's fired upon by the Brazilian authorities because they don't recognize his ship, but he finally makes it into Rio. He hangs around in the city for a little while. He finds a Portuguese firm that says, "We have a cargo you can take, but it's not bound for New York, it's bound for the Cargo River. Do you want it?" And Oaksmith, needing to make some money, says yes. And so he takes this cargo on, and several of the Portuguese businessmen get on board as well, and they head east across the Atlantic Ocean. When they get to the Congo River, they are approached by 2 British warships. These were British ships that were part of the Africa Squadron that were responsible for patrolling the west coast of Africa for evidence of slave trading. Now keep in mind international law at this time. Appleton does not have to allow British ships onto his vessel. But if he had nothing to hide, he had no problem with doing it. And so he allowed these sailors onto his ship. They presumably looked around, they had conversation, and then they went on their way. Now, I know that these British sailors were good at what they've done because I went to the British National Archives and looked at their records, and I found records of them catching slavers a week or 2 before. So they knew what they were doing when they were looking, and presumably they didn't find evidence on this ship. Eventually, then, Appleton starts to head in towards the Congo River. The Congo River has a very strong current, and he could not make it around the bend into the river, and he winds up getting beached. At that point, somewhere between 1,500 and 3,000 African warriors see him, and with very rude weaponry, with muskets that they're filling with rocks and pieces of shell and shards of metal, they start attacking his ship. And he's a sitting duck. Except for that, the British, who had just searched him, come and rescue him. They unload his cargo so that the ship raises in its weight and is able to sail off, and they save his life. Now, historians have written about this because this moment actually got international headlines and became known as the Battle of the Congo. And some historians believe that Appleton was involved in a slave trading voyage here. I actually don't think he was at this point. Or if he was, I think it was unwitting. I think maybe the Portuguese were going to get him there and try to force him into a slave trading voyage, which is actually something that happened frequently, where sailors would wind up on the high seas before they would be told what they were doing. So maybe unwittingly he was involved in a slave trading voyage here, but I actually don't think he was. He was lucky to be alive. He headed back west, and he made it to New York City, where he got involved in some unfortunate schemes. If any of you know about the filibustering in Nicaragua in the mid-1850s, he was William Walker's right-hand man. He then tried to raise money for Cuban liberation from Spain later in the 1850s. He lost his shirt in these two endeavors. And by the end of the 1850s, he was completely flat broke. Now, at the same time, he also traveled to Portland, Maine to visit some friends, and while he was there, he met a lovely soprano immigrant from near Smyrna, near the Middle East. And he meets her, and after 10 days, he falls in love with her and gets married. And to the young people in the room, I'll just say, it's rarely a wise decision to get married after 10 days of knowing someone. And that certainly proved true in this case. Appleton marries this woman, Isata. They begin to have children. He's flat broke. And his brother also gets married and has children, and his brother was flat broke. And so what did they do? They all moved in with mom and dad on Long Island, and it was one big unhappy family. In 1859, trying to make some money and trying to get back into the literary world, Appleton and his parents start a monthly literary magazine, but it flops. And so Appleton somehow connects with a fish oil factory owner on Long Island and begins working with him. I'll come back to that in a second. Now, as most of you know, in December of 1860, the South begins seceding, and Appleton gets involved in the Tammany Hall Democratic political machine in New York City and starts trying to put on rallies that will preserve the Union. But those rallies go nowhere. And so now, flat broke, living at home with mom and dad and his family and his brother's family, he and this fish oil factory owner decide, we need whale oil for the fish oil factory. And so they decide, we're going to start buying some old whaling vessels, and we're going to go out and we're going to do some short whaling voyages and get some whale oil, and we're going to bring it back to New York. Now, the thing is, getting into the whaling industry in 1861 looked really suspicious. because in 1859, petroleum had been discovered in Titusville, Pennsylvania. And so the whaling industry had completely tanked. And so someone getting into it for the first time looks like maybe they're actually going to want to get involved in a slaving expedition rather than a whaling one. And so a ship owner in New York willingly sells Appleton his old whaling vessel and then promptly goes to the U.S. Marshal and says, Appleton Oaksmith just bought my ship and I think he's going to go on a slaving voyage. You should go arrest him. And so the U.S. Marshal does precisely that. Now, they didn't have any evidence that Appleton was actually on a slaving voyage at this point. And so they had to kind of skirt the law a little bit. And this is something I talked about with the class this morning. Lincoln had suspended the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus in 1861 between New York and Washington, D.C. And what that meant was that Lincoln could use the military to arrest people and essentially hold them without charges if they were suspected of wanting to help the Confederate war effort. And so they simply said, well, we think Appleton is disloyal. Now, nobody thought he was disloyal. People thought maybe he's a slave trader, but he had just been doing these Tammany Hall Union meetings. No one thought he was disloyal. But they used that as a pretext to arrest him. And so they arrested him and threw him in Fort Lafayette in New York Harbor. He's being held there, not knowing what he's charged with, in this casemate here. And meanwhile, his mother begins writing letters to try to talk to anyone she can to get her son released. And this is a letter that his mother sent to Abraham Lincoln. Now, I mentioned a little bit ago that Elizabeth Oaksmith was very famous in her day. I'm convinced that Abraham Lincoln knew who she was. You see, Lincoln received upwards of 200 to 300 letters a day. And most of those letters got funneled out to the federal bureaucracy and are now housed at the National Archives in some record group. The letters that really meant something to Lincoln, he kept, and they're in his papers at the Library of Congress. And this letter from Elizabeth Oaksmith is in his private papers at the Library of Congress. And Lincoln actually wrote back to her. She sent him a poem, and he wrote back thanking her for the beautiful poem. Now, Elizabeth Oaksmith and Appleton's wife did not get along. They hated each other. But on this one particular day, they were working together to try, I do have the picture here. They were working together to try to write letters to get Appleton released from prison. And this is the letter that Isata sent to Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln had no clue who she was. So this letter got sent out, and now it's in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. It's the one time these two women would work together. Well, Appleton is wallowing in prison in New York. Meanwhile, the federal government is trying to decide, can we get a conviction for him in New York? Nathaniel Gordon has just had his hung jury, so they don't know that yet. But they found out that Appleton had also been buying ships in New Bedford, Massachusetts. And so they decide, let's move him up there. And so they transport him to Fort Warren in Boston Harbor, which is a national park site that you can visit today. And they then give an order for release. And in January of 1862, Appleton is over the moon, thinking, I'm finally going to be released. And he walks out of the prison doors, and there are the U.S. Marshal and the U.S. Attorney for Boston. And they promptly arrest him under civil charges of outfitting ships for the slave trade. Now, if you look at these names, I would guess that none of you have ever heard of John S. Keyes, but I would guess that many of you know Richard Henry Dana Jr., the very famous Harvard man who was a sailor and wrote 2 years before the mast. Richard Henry Dana Jr. was, by the way, a fan of Seba Smith's Jack Downing stories. So these two men arrest Appleton Oaksmith and take him to the local jail. The Charles Street Jail had just been built in 1851. It was a model prison from which you were never supposed to be able to escape. It's still there today, and I'll tell a quick aside. By the 1970s, this jail had become so run down that the prisoners sued and claimed that their Eighth Amendment rights were being violated. And so a federal judge who was presiding over this case surprised the jailers one day, showed up in 1973 and said, I'm Judge Garrity, lock me in. And they locked the judge in for a night, and it was so bad that when he got back out, he shut down the jail. It sat vacant for 20 years until Harvard acquired it. And now it's a luxury hotel. For a mere $600 or $700 a night, you can stay in an old prison like Appleton Oaksmith. I've been there twice. I've had very expensive meals I'll tell you about the meals in a second, actually. I'll hold that. So Appleton is thrown into the Charles Street jail. He's then brought into court, where he is accused of being the head of an enormous slave trading ring. And Appleton says, I'm not, I'm innocent. And the U.S. Attorney, Richard Henry Dana, calls for a very high bail to be set. And Appleton says, I have no money. And Dana says, but you're connected to this large slave trading ring. You clearly have money. And Appleton says, I don't. And so the judge actually grants a very low bail, but Appleton had no money, and so he could not post bond to be released from prison. And so he is sent back to prison to await trial. The trial finally takes place in June of 1862. Now, through various mechanisms, the federal government had worked deliberately to make sure that Appleton could not get good legal representation. And so he wound up having to use his uncle. And I've always heard that you never want to have a lawyer or a friend or a relative be your lawyer. And I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what I've heard. So he gets his uncle, and maybe it's just that his uncle didn't have a lot to work with. But the strategy that his uncle came up with was to have Appleton sitting at the defense table surrounded by 13 women and girls, including his mother, his oldest daughter, and his sister-in-law. And the hope was that the jury would just look at this guy sitting next to all these women and think, well, he can't possibly be guilty. And at one point, his sister-in-law, Fanny, is testifying, and they'd planned this out. She's at the witness stand, and she's testifying, and she passes out. And Appleton jumps up from the defense table and runs and catches her before she hits the ground. And then they get out some smelling salts, and they wake her up, and the jury is just sitting there like, wow, look at this guy. But it didn't work. And he was found guilty. He was sent back to the Charles Street jail. And using the original plans from the 1840s and early 1850s, I think I figured out where his cell was. And it's in a restaurant called Clink. And if you go in, if you're in Boston at some point and you want to see where I believe his cell was, I think it's one of the first two doors in this restaurant Clink. And that's my laptop there, and a picture I took of him outside of the prison cell, because I wanted to really capture something of what it was like for him, although I think the food's a lot better now than it was back then. So he's sitting in prison, and he's awaiting sentencing. And somehow, on the night of September 10th or early morning hours of September 11th, 1862, he escapes from prison. I've not been able to quite figure out how this happened, but I have my hunches. Appleton was a very worldly guy. He had been traveling the world since he was 16. When he was 16 years old, he made his first voyage to China. He'd been all over the place. He was a writer. People knew who he was. And the guards really enjoyed talking to him. Now, if you go to the hotel today, the old guard station is now the lobby. It's in the center of the hotel. And Appleton would sit in there talking with the guards at night, and they enjoyed chatting with him. And every night, at some point, he would just get up and go to his cell, and then they would follow him a little bit later and close the door behind him. And then the next day, they would wake him up, and the same thing would happen. Well, on this night of September 10th, he's in the guard station talking with the guards, and a female prisoner from another floor rings a bell that she needs some medicine. And so the guards go and give her the medicine, and when they return, Appleton's no longer there, and they just assume he's gone into his cell, so they go and they lock the door. They look in, and it looks like he's in the bed. They lock the door, and they go about their business. Well, the next morning, the prisoners get up to make breakfast, and they slide the breakfast under his door, and he doesn't eat it. And finally, by 10 or 11 in the morning, they're, Appleton, get out of bed, eat your breakfast. And they open up the cell door, they pull off the sheets, and there's clothes and other things that have been stuffed under the blankets, so that it looked like he was there, and he made his escape. He made his way down to Havana, Cuba, where his brother was working as a photographer. And this is actually a photograph that his brother took of Havana that a friend bought me as a gift on eBay, which was a pretty cool thing to get. And for the first few months, he recovered his health after having been imprisoned for several months, or for a year now. But by now, he was very bitter. He was very bitter at the Union because of how he saw himself as having been mistreated. And so he began working as a Confederate blockade runner, making runs on very small, quick ships between Galveston, Texas, and Havana, Cuba. and he makes several runs on the high seas, and I describe these in the book, where he almost gets caught several times, but they're never able to quite catch him. And it's finally by the summer of 1864 that larger international affairs step in. There was a Cuban slave trader named Jose Agustin Arguelles. And Arguelles was actually a small-time leader in the government in Cuba, and an illegal shipment of Africans had been brought in. And Arguelles he worked with a local priest to make it look like most of the Africans had died, and then he took them and sold them into slavery in Cuba. And he got a $15,000 reward for having dealt with this case and making it look like everything was on the up and up. And then when you factor in the $700 to $750 that he made per person, he made another $100,000 equivalent in U.S. money. So this guy made $115,000 illegally selling slaves. And when he was found out by the Cuban government, Arguelles escaped to Manhattan. And so here's the situation in the summer of 1864. Appleton Oaksmith has been on the lam for 2 years, hanging out in Havana, and now a Cuban slave trader is hanging out in Manhattan, and both governments want them back. And this is the Captain General of Cuba. He was an abolitionist who really wanted to get Arguelles back. Now, the difficulty here was that there was no extradition treaty between the United States and Spain. So they couldn't just arrest one guy and exchange him for another, or even arrest him and send him back. And what I think happened is the Spanish minister in Washington, D.C. got together with Secretary of State William Seward, and they said, let's make a deal. You kidnap our guy and send him back to us. We'll kidnap your guy, send him back to you, and we'll all be even. And they liked that plan. So the same U.S. Marshal who had put Nathaniel Gordon in the Tombs finds Arguelles in Manhattan, kidnaps him, arrests him, sends him back to Cuba, and Arguelles gets 19 years at hard labor. Meanwhile, Appleton is in Havana, and one night in September of 1864, somewhere between 11 p.m. and midnight, a squad of Cuban police show up at the home of Appleton's brother, where Appleton was living. They break through the front door, they go into a bedroom, and they find a very sick man in bed, and they drag him out of bed, and he says, I can't walk, I'm so sick. And they said, no, you're coming with us. And they get him outside, and then they start to look at each other. Is it him? Is it him? Yes, it's him. Yes, it's him. And 3 of the police go back into the home. They find a servant. They say, show us a picture of Appleton Oaksmith. The servant shows them a picture. They look at the picture. They look at the guy they've arrested, and they realize they got his brother instead. Somehow Appleton had been tipped off that the Cuban police were coming for him that night, and he made it out of Havana, and they then let Sidney go back to sleep. This moment made national headlines that the U.S. government was involved in an international kidnapping scheme of accused slave traders. And the conservative members of Lincoln's cabinet were furious that Lincoln was violating, in their minds, the Constitution and international law to do this. The Attorney General Edward Bates said that Secretary of State Seward was led to this hazardous measure, which was clearly illegal, he said, by his belief that it would be a capital hit with the extreme anti-slavery men. And the Attorney General said of the Secretary of State, constitutional limitations are to him unnecessary restraints. And the Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles, said that as a nation, I won't use that quote. Welles also criticized him, I'll leave it at that. Lincoln stayed silent on this issue. He let the Democrats criticize him during the presidential election. Lincoln didn't say anything about it till after the election, when Lincoln publicly said this: for myself, I have no doubt of the power and duty of the executive under the law of nations to exclude enemies of the human race from an asylum in the United States. In other words, if you commit a crime against humanity, you will not find protection in the U.S. And that was how Lincoln justified this kidnapping scheme. Well, what about Appleton Oaksmith? I'll conclude the story here, and then if there's questions, I'm happy to take them. I mentioned to you that Appleton was in a really unhappy marriage, and his wife and his mother hated one another. Well, believe it or not, the state of Indiana had really lax divorce laws in the 1850s and into the 1860s so that you could get a mail-order divorce. And in New York City, if you look at the New York newspapers, you will see lawyers advertising, want a divorce, come to us. And what the lawyers would do is they would forge papers saying that you lived in Indiana. They would get you the divorce without your partner even knowing, and then you'd be scot-free. And so somehow, in the summer of 1864, Appleton procures a divorce from his wife, Asada. There's poor Asada, and here's the divorce paper that I was able to track down. Asada had no idea that she had been divorced. Appleton leaves Savannah after this botched kidnapping attempt. He goes to Canada, where he now marries his cousin, Augusta Mason. And he and his cousin set off on their new life in England. He then sends for poor Asada to come to England, and she believes she's going to be reunited with her husband and children. And when she gets there, Appleton says, we can't be seen in public together, it'll look suspicious. They have a few meetings, and then finally they meet at one point, and Appleton presents divorce papers to her and says, sign these or you'll never see your children again. And Asada signs these papers because she feels like she has no other options. And she leaves and she heads back to her family in Smyrna near Turkey. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Oakesmith has been working relentlessly to get Lincoln to pardon her, and after Lincoln died, to get Andrew Johnson to pardon her son. And at one point in 1867, she goes to the White House and she meets with President Johnson. And Johnson is on the verge of pardoning Appleton Oakesmith when Asada finds out. And the jilted ex-wife rushes to the White House, says, my ex-husband's a scoundrel, don't pardon him. And Andrew Johnson listens to her instead of the mother and refuses to pardon Appleton Oakesmith. And you have to know something about Reconstruction to gather the irony of this moment, because Andrew Johnson pardoned every ex-Confederate, but he refused to pardon Appleton Oakesmith. So Appleton Oakesmith remains in exile until 1872. But he hires some high-powered lawyers, and they convince Ulysses S. Grant that he was innocent, and Grant issues a pardon in 1872. Appleton and his family get on a boat. They head back to the United States. They stop in North Carolina near Wilmington. And one day, they weren't planning to be there long, but Appleton is walking on a street, and he sees a land auction going on. And he figures, I'll help the auctioneer out, so he puts in a bid on some land and goes about his business. And the next day, someone comes up to him and says, you got to go pay for that. And he says, what are you talking about? And the man says, no one else bid. You won the land. And so Appleton ended up settling for the rest of his life on the coast of North Carolina. And this is where the story this story has so many twists and turns. I'm just scratching the surface here. But this is where the story takes an extraordinary turn. Appleton runs for state legislature in North Carolina in 1874 as an anti-Klan, pro-black civil rights, independent Democrat. And he gets elected. He is in a biracial state legislature, standing shoulder to shoulder with black legislators. And during this time, Appleton goes to New York City and gives a speech at the Cooper Union, which is a very famous art institute in New York, where Lincoln gave a famous speech. He gave a speech in the late 1870s at the Cooper Union calling for the abolition of slavery around the world. And he shared the stage with the most famous black preacher of that era, Henry Highland Garnett. And I don't know how to explain it. I have no clue how to explain this transformation in this man, and I'll tell you something kind of sad. As I was writing this book, I got an email from one of his great-great-granddaughters. And she said, we take our family history very seriously. And she said, I have his memoir that he wrote, and I won't let you see it. Because she said I was defaming her family in writing this book. And she actually threatened me with legal action. So if there are lawyers in the room, I might need to call you later and get some help with that. She threatened to sue me for defaming her family just in telling the story of this man. And I've often wondered, what would that memoir tell me? Would it tell me exactly how he escaped from prison? Or would it tell me how his views of African Americans changed from the 1850s and 60s, when he was possibly involved in the slave trade, to the 1870s, when he fights for black civil rights as a state legislator? It's an incredible story, I think. He's kind of the Forrest Gump of the Civil War era, where he touches, I don't know if that lands with the college students in the room, but for the older folks, you know what I'm talking about. His life touches all these incredible moments of the Civil War era, from first wave feminism to the gold rush to filibustering to the secession movement to Civil War to Reconstruction politics. And in the process, it shows us just how adamantly Lincoln wanted to destroy the slave trade. That he would use suspension of habeas corpus and potentially violating international law to make sure that Appleton Oaksmith would get justice. And Lincoln's Secretary of State William Seward said this, and I'll just close with this. Seward said, "We are a powerful nation, and it is simply a point of duty to apply our power to bring this evil to an end." And as Barbara mentioned at the beginning, this is a part of Lincoln's legacy that should be remembered. In the midst of fighting an enormous civil war, Lincoln also wants to make sure that one of the most heinous evils in the history of the world will be brought to a close. And this is part of the story of how Lincoln did it. So with that, thank you so much for having me. Do we have time for questions? And I know there's a microphone, so if you have a question, even if you can talk loudly, please wait for the mic so that the camera picks it up as well. So there's someone, we'll be going around with the mics. The first question's always the hardest.
Well, I guess that since I have the mic, I'll go ahead and start. I'm Ellen Arnold. I'm the chair of the history department. I guess, did he want to start a slave trade, or did he want to kill whales?
So it's the million-dollar question. And so I'll give you a little more detail about how they went about making the accusation and what his defense was. And in a sense, what I'll say is, if he was going to do it, they caught him before he did. So Nathaniel Gordon was caught red-handed. He's caught with 897 human beings below decks. There's no doubt in anyone's mind. There's enough witnesses to say this is what happened. In Appleton's case, what they had to... So first they go on the word of the man who sold him the ship. And what they had to do, so they charge him with outfitting ships for the slave trade. In other words, getting the ships ready to go on a slave trading voyage. And so what they had to do is look at what does he have? What's his cargo? What are his stores and provisions? What's on board? And is it what you would need for a slaving voyage, or is it what you would need for a whaling voyage? Now, most whaling voyages in the 19th century would be 3 years long. So when you would go out on a whaling voyage, you'd leave Nantucket or you'd leave New Bedford. You'd be gone for 3 years. So if you had little kids, if you have a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old, when you come back, they're 6 and 8. If you come back and you've got a 1-year-old, you know you have a problem at home. So you would go on one of these voyages with a lot of certain stores and provisions, because it's going to be a long time before you stop at the Azores or somewhere else to get more food and water. And so they looked at what Appleton had, and they said, well, there's not a lot here, and so we don't think he's really doing a 3-year voyage. We think he's doing a short voyage. Appleton's response was, we're not typical whale hunters who are going on a 3-year voyage. We were going to go for a short period of time and then just get some whale oil to use in the fish oil factory. Now, there were barrels and barrels of stockpiled whale oil in New Bedford, Massachusetts. So if they really needed whale oil, I don't know why they didn't just go by there and buy some at depressed prices. And the other thing that makes Appleton look suspicious is that when he was in New Bedford, he signed checks and papers with a fake name. So that's also something that I wanted to leave some things in the book for you to discover, but I'll tell you that here too. So there were some things that certainly are incriminating. Appleton claimed innocence for his whole life. The prosecutor and the judge and the U.S. Marshal claimed that he was guilty for his whole life. His family was convinced that the U.S. Marshal was corrupt. And I actually think there's evidence of this. I did a lot of research at the Library of Congress, and I found some evidence of this. The way that a lot of federal offices worked in the 19th century is very different from how it works today. So now we have civil service, and federal employees have their salaries and job protection and so forth. In the 19th century, before the Pendleton Act in 1881, if you were a federal employee, you were appointed by the president. And when the next president came into power, you tended to lose your job. And some federal offices are obviously still like that. But for the U.S. Marshals and for other positions like that, the way it would work is you would get your appointment and you would have a certain amount of pay, salary. But you, as the marshal, were also responsible to sell things that were captured and then brought into your court. So, say a ship is captured. You're responsible to sell it, and then you could make hundreds of thousands of dollars in 1860s money in a year by selling off the ships and the cargo. And so it was actually a system that lent itself to corruption. So sailors capture a ship on the high seas. They take it into court. The court condemns it. The ship gets sold. The sailors get their cut. The judge gets his cut. The marshal gets his cut. The U.S. attorney gets his cut. Everyone gets their cut. And so I think there's some very real evidence that the U.S. Marshal Robert Murray was corrupt. I can't prove that. It's circumstantial. So Appleton's family, they constantly made the case that Robert Murray was corrupt, and that because they knew, because Appleton had some information about it, that's why Robert Murray was always going after him. And those charges of corruption kept coming up. In the 1870s, when New York elections are going on, I mean, people are talking about, was Robert Murray corrupt in these slave trading cases? But as in a lot of corruption cases, it's really hard to find the evidence, especially when the evidence is 160 years old. So in the book, what I try to do is tell the story almost as if you were reading it in real time, like if you're reading it in the newspapers. And I try to have the story unfold with all the different sides kind of giving their perspective. And I don't exclude evidence. So I give the evidence that might be exculpatory, and I give the evidence that shows Appleton's personality. And I'll say this. One of the big things for me in writing this book was I figured out Appleton's birthday. And that might not seem like a big deal, but Wikipedia, the greatest of all sources, had his birthday as Valentine's Day because a historian in the 1950s had misread a diary. And I figured out that his birthday was March 22nd. And that's my wife's birthday. And so in the acknowledgments of my book, the last thing I did was I thanked my wife for, just being so wonderful. And I said, she shares a birthday with Appleton Oaksmith, but none of his disreputable characteristics. And I ran that by her before I put it in print. She was okay with that. He was certainly a problematic figure. Whether he was really slave trading, I'm not 100% sure. I don't think he was in 1852. He might have been in 1861. Yeah.
To encourage or perhaps to discourage the current students of history here at Ohio Wesleyan, can you share with us whatever happened to the young man who discovered Appleton for you?
So Daniel Glenn is an incredible young man. In 2019, he and I published a book together. It was a collection of letters of a student at Dickinson College during the Civil War. That was the first time I published with a student. I've done 4 peer-reviewed articles with students, and in April of 2025, I'll publish my 3rd peer-reviewed book with a student. So I've worked with a lot of really great students at CNU, getting them to do research. And Daniel gained a really strong background in how to do research and how to write well, and it served him very well. So I helped him get an internship at the U.S. Supreme Court. For any of you, I know Ethan is here and wants to go to law school. If any of you are thinking about law school, the U.S. Supreme Court has an unpaid internship opportunity. So it's a little expensive to be there. But I'm going to give you the clue that I gave Daniel. And it helped that I knew the curator at the Supreme Court. So I was able to call her and say, Daniel's really great, you should hire him. But this isn't recorded, is it? No, I'm kidding. So you can, if you get an internship at the Supreme Court, you can apply to work in the Chief Justice's office, in the clerk's office, the public affairs office, or the curator's office. Now, most college students who want an internship at the Supreme Court are thinking, hey, I want to work for the Chief Justice. Like, how cool would that be? Very few think about, I'm going to work in the curator's office. So even though Daniel didn't have an interest in art history, I suggested that he apply for that because it'd be less competitive, and he got it. So he got an while he was still in college, he got an internship at the U.S. Supreme Court. The following year, he got an internship with the U.S. Department of Justice. He then went on to William & Mary Law School, graduated from William & Mary a year or two ago. He clerked for the chief judge in Richmond for the state court system. He then clerked last year in a federal court in Texas, right on the Texas-Mexico border. It's the busiest federal court in the country, and not for immigration cases. The judge there has a reputation for dealing with patent cases in a particular way, that patent attorneys just love to go to that court. And so Daniel got an internship there, a clerkship there, and now he is back working for the DOJ, the Department of Justice. So he's done really well for himself. And as a professor, it's always incredible to get to see your students move on and do great things, and he's one of the ones I'm really proud of. So thank you for asking.
Well, thank you for coming to town today and giving that lecture. I enjoyed it very much. Before I ask my question, ironically, I'd just like to say you and I happen to share the exact same name.
Oh, yeah?
And a love for Lincoln, so whenever I write my Lincoln book, I think that will be to my great benefit.
Oh, good.
Folks thinking it's you. My question...
Can I pause you for a second? There's an anti-Lincoln guy named Jonathan White who also teaches at a university in Virginia, and for some reason, when people search for me or search for him, they get me, and then I get the nasty grams. So I hope that your book will be complimentary of Lincoln.
Well, I'll have to get a new moniker, it sounds
Yeah.
like. So my question is, you stated at the end there that you weren't able to explain why Oak Smith kind of made the change he did. So he ended up in the legislator
State legislature.
As a state legislator in South Carolina.
North Carolina, yeah.
Or North Carolina, as an independent Democrat, I think you described him. Did he try to, I guess, maybe in appeasing his potential sins, try to pass any civil rights type legislation while he was in the legislature?
Yeah, I speculate about that. So he spoke out in favor of the U.S. Civil Rights Bill, Civil Rights Act of 1875, and he gave some speeches in favor of black civil rights. He was not fully in favor of black equality, political or social equality, but he was in favor of the expansion of political and civil rights for African Americans. And I speculate in the book that it may be some sort of penance for his past sins, or it may have been, now that he's living in North Carolina, interacting with African Americans, that it's possible that those interactions changed his perspective. What's ironic is that his mother then moves down with him after her husband dies. In 1868, her husband dies. She stays in Long Island for a while, and then by the 1870s moves to North Carolina. His mother had been an abolitionist. She's a first-wave feminist in the 1850s, so she's inclined towards abolitionism. Although she's a Democrat, so she is more racist in that era, but she still favors abolitionism, but she's always very clear with other reformers, my first priority is women's rights. Black rights come later. So she has this inclination towards abolitionism, but she's not really on board, but she's inclined in that way. When she moves to North Carolina, she actually has the exact opposite direction of Appleton. So Appleton moves more towards black rights, and Elizabeth actually moves further away from supporting African Americans. And she writes very disparagingly of African Americans in her diary and other writings. So it's a very peculiar development to see happen in their family and in their relationship. And without them, I mean, the only evidence I have to go on are the public speeches that Appleton gave. And he somehow figured out how to thread the needle, because he ran against an ex-Confederate, regular Democrat, and I think he ran against a Republican, and he was kind of the guy in the middle, and he was able to win a majority. Yeah. Hey, Justin.
Hey, John. So I just have a question. I work with young kids. What's it like when you find that divorce record? Like you're in an archive and you find, is it like your Super Bowl? Do you scream out like nobody's in the room, but you're like, oh my gosh?
Yeah, I've definitely done that. The thing I always say to students, and so I'll say this to the students who are here, doing historical research is like detective work, and that's what makes it fun. So the first thing is you're reading other people's mail. Like, that's illegal if you do it to someone today, but you can do it for dead people. So I do it all the time. And oftentimes you'll find a letter that gives you half of a conversation, and then you have to figure out where's the other half. And half of the conversation might be in California, and the other half might be in North Carolina or Philadelphia. Like, you just never know where the letters wind up. And so the fun of it for me is doing the archival research. And those moments when you find something that you never would have expected, they're exhilarating. I mean, it sounds corny, I guess, but they really can be. Or when you're going through, I have held hundreds of Lincoln documents in my hand, going through records at the National Archives. And every time, even though I've held hundreds of Lincoln documents in my hand, I've seen his signature hundreds of times, every time you find a new one that you didn't know about, and someone else has seen it before. It's not like I'm discovering something that's completely unknown, but knowing that you're holding a piece of paper that the greatest American held is pretty moving. So, yeah.
I have a question about the penetration of information in this time period.
Yeah.
So I'm imagining, of course, because I'm from Philadelphia, I'm imagining, of course, that the people who are on the East Coast in the big cities have information and read these newspapers and publications. But when you get over the mountains, when you get further towards Pittsburgh, or when you get, how much does this information, these stories, belong only to an elite or
It's a great question.
geographical people and not others?
So the telegraph is in existence at this point, and so news travels very, very quickly. The way that it tended to work was that the biggest, most important newspapers were in New York City. So the New York Times is founded in 1851. The Philadelphia Inquirer is founded in the 1850s. Actually, I think it had a predecessor, but in its current form in the 1850s. There's a New York Daily News, which is not a predecessor of the current New York Daily News, but there's big New York newspapers. The most important newspapers are the New York Times and the New York Tribune and the New York Herald. Now, the thing you got to know about newspapers in the 1860s is that they were all unabashedly partisan. So today our journalists pretend like they're nonpartisan, but we all know that they're not. And if you're conservative, you watch one cable news station, and if you're progressive, you watch a different cable news station. And we just sort of accept that you go to the media that you want to hear their perspective. In the 19th century, they didn't hide it. So if you were a Republican in your city, there was a Republican newspaper, and if you were a Democrat, there was a Democrat newspaper, and you subscribed to your party's paper, and you voted to try to get your party in power, because if your party got in power, then they would give government money to your newspaper to print things. So there was a lot to be gained. So you've got these big newspapers in New York, and some of them are Republican and some of them are Democrat. And what would happen is the papers from New York would circulate out to the rest of the country, because people all over the country would subscribe to the New York Tribune. They wanted to hear what Horace Greeley had to say. And the copyright issue was very different back then. So what would happen is the newspaper editors in the small towns all over the country would just copy and paste. Students, you can't do this. It's called plagiarism, so don't do this in your papers. But in the newspapers in the 1860s, that's what they did. So you're in the middle of nowhere in Indiana or Illinois or Kansas or Iowa, you're still reading what the New York Times is saying, because if your local Republican newspaper is going to take the Republican New York Times and reprint their articles. It might take a little while. And the way you can kind of get a sense of it, if you go on newspapers.com, which is how I do a lot of my research, you could search for a story, and you'll find that the same story appears 20 times on newspapers.com. And what you can do is you can kind of trace the story moving westward. So it first appears in an eastern newspaper, and then eventually gets its way to Ohio, and then it'll get out to Illinois, and then eventually it'll get to California. And the California newspapers will be publishing New York newspaper stories. It just it could take a week or more for the story to spread. So Appleton Oaksmith, he's making national headlines. The articles are all pretty much the same, because it's what originally appeared in New York or Boston, and then the other papers are just copying it.
But he's so far away from where they live. Does it matter to them?
That he's so far...
He's so far away from the people in California. Does it really matter to the readers?
Oh, yeah.
How does that work?
The Appleton's story is told, the kidnapping story, that gets told in the California papers. They want to know, and especially, see, the Democrats want to tell that story, because the Democrats want to defeat Abraham Lincoln in 1864. And so they can say, look at what Lincoln's doing. He's superintending these international illegal kidnapping schemes. So I think, I can't prove this because it was done anonymously, but I think that Appleton's brother, Sidney, wrote the first article on the botched kidnapping. And the reason I think it was him is that he was there. I mean, they arrested him. So he describes, like, in verbatim, this is what the police are saying, and this is what the really sick guy was replying. Like, only he would have known that. So I think what happened was, I think he wrote it down, sent it to his mother in New York. I think his mother gave it to a Democratic newspaper. It appeared in the papers, and then it spread through the country. And Democrats wanted to know about that. Now, a lot of Elizabeth Oaksmith's papers survive. There's a huge collection at the University of Virginia. There's a huge collection at the New York Public Library. But sadly, she also burned a ton of her stuff. And so there are a lot of holes that we'll never have filled because she burned her papers, so much of her papers. You know, to Justin's question, one of the best things as a historian is when you find a letter that at the top says, after you've read this, burn it. You'll love to see that. Here.
Do I need to stand up?
No, that's fine.
Oh, I'm going to ask this question as a secret questioner. Did Lincoln ever change, either by law or policy, the right of other nations to board U.S. trips during the slave trade?
To board U.S. ships. Okay, so the question was, did Lincoln ever change this policy about boarding ships? Yes. In 1862, Secretary of State William Seward negotiated a treaty with Lord Lyons, the British minister in Washington, D.C., that allowed for the British to be allowed to board U.S. ships. So it took Lincoln to get that done. The treaty before that was from 1842. It was called the Webster-Ashburton Treaty. It had been negotiated by Daniel Webster. And Daniel Webster did not want the British to be able to board American ships. John Quincy Adams, this anti-slavery leader, said it would be worse than slavery to allow the British to board American ships. And I think it's a lot bit of an overstatement. But it gives you a sense of, for most Americans in the 19th century, they loathe the idea of the British being able to board American ships. But now, when the Civil War began, Lincoln came up with this arguably illegal plan to blockade the Confederate coastline. And so he needed as many ships as he could to blockade the Confederate coast. Now, the Webster-Ashburton Treaty from 1842 said the British are not allowed to search American ships and the Americans can't search British ships, but both nations need to have warships on the coast of Africa. So both nations would have their own Africa squadron to search for slave traders. Well, when Lincoln now needs blockaders to stop Confederate blockade runners like Appleton Oaksmith from going in and out, he needs all those ships from the west coast of Africa. So now the situation's changed. And now Americans are going to be open to the idea of allowing the British to search American ships. So in April of 1862, Seward negotiates this treaty, the Senate ratifies it, and from that point forward, the American ships are no longer needed on the west coast of Africa. Those ships are brought back. The British can search American ships. And then they create courts in various places around the world that if the British capture American ships, they can be taken to, and Lincoln appoints judges to those courts. The courts never end up hearing any cases that I know of, but Lincoln is working through international law in every way he can to stop the slave trade. Should we make this be the last one? I don't, yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong. I think you had mentioned that in his youth, Oaksmith was involved in the Cuban independence movement. And so I was just wondering how you think that colored his decision to go to Cuba and his, relationship while he was there with Spanish authorities and Cuban locals.
It's a great question. I think his primary reason for going to Havana after he escaped from prison was because his brother was there. So he and his brother were very close. He needed to get out of the United States, and I think he just figured this is going to be the safest place for me to go. He probably knew there was no extradition treaty. The U.S. consul in Havana immediately takes note of him being there and starts sending messages to Washington, D.C. saying, here's what Appleton's doing, I'm keeping an eye on him. And that consul then begins working with the Cuban authorities, with the Captain General, to start creating a plan to extradite him back to the United States. It ultimately takes the deal being made in Washington to get that in play. I don't think that Appleton had many interactions with the Cuban authorities because I think he knew that the Captain General was an abolitionist and what he was accused of, and so I think he probably just kind of was doing his Confederate blockade running thing without much interaction, but they were aware of his presence from the very beginning. And it appeared in the newspapers. I mean, so it's kind of funny. Whenever you write history, you always have to kind of watch out for the family lore, because families tell stories over time, and they're often not true. So the family lore is that Appleton actually spent like months or maybe even a year in Maine in hiding. Well, I found, using newspapers.com, in a newspaper in October 1862 that he had made it to Havana. So I was able to figure that piece out because of the newspapers. So, sorry, just to connect those. Well, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed my time here. Are you coming up? Or?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. White, on behalf of the History Department. We are always so grateful that this lecture and our other two endowed lectures that will be taking place in the spring are chances to bring high-powered scholars in touch with not only our student body and our alumni, but also the members of the extended OWU community. Thank you all for taking your evening and coming out and joining us, and thank you very much for your time. I was particularly struck by the way in which you spoke so favorably of online academic research and of even Wikipedia. And I just want to take this moment to acknowledge that a new path for those in the audience who care deeply about both Dick and Betty Smith, there is now a new opportunity to contribute to their continuing spirit of supporting students and learners at OWU through the Dick Smith Journal Fund that will support the university libraries providing access to things like newspapers.com and JSTOR for the student community. So thank you all very much.